so I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's Dale Recinella. And Dale is a very expert on this field, in this field of topic of discussion, having spent 25 years as a spiritual advisor to persons on death row and solitary confinement. He's, as I said, he's something of an expert. You can see from the bio in the program. And I consider him to be quite the treasure of this diocese and of this state, and I'm apparently not the only one who considers him a treasure, as he was just awarded the Papal Pro Ecclesia et Pontifice Cross.
I think so.
which is the highest award given by the Catholic Church, given by the Pope, to a lay person. It was just awarded that last Wednesday. So yes, give him a round of applause. We are very fortunate to have Dale in our diocese and in our parish, and today as our speaker. Thank you so much for coming, Dale.
It's a gorgeous Saturday morning. Spring is here, and so I know you had plenty of other things begging for your time, and you're choosing to be here with us this morning really makes us feel supported and edified that you agree that this is a very important issue that we need to be addressing and not dodging, not just as people of faith, but as people of faith who are also citizens. So we thank you for being here this morning. I need to mention that service award that I received Wednesday night, everybody's asking me, when did you find out? I found out at the Mass. I had no idea, and I think Bishop Parks wanted to see if he could shock an Italian lawyer into speechlessness. And he did. So when I got back to the pew with it, I looked at Susan and I said, "What do I do?" She said, "Take it home and hide it before they can take it back." Most of you know my wife Susan. She's going to be on the panel. I want to introduce to you another couple who I asked to be here. They came from Jacksonville. Susan and I speak on the death penalty all over Florida. Last weekend we were speaking in Sarasota at St. Thomas More. And we also speak around the country. And we constantly get asked, well, if you don't kill them, what are we going to do with them? Back in 1990, when we were still here in Tallahassee the first time, a lot of you can remember that. Father Foley, you can remember it, right? I got asked to come to Appalachia Correctional Institution in Sneads, 50 miles west of here, because we were doing AIDS ministry here down in Frenchtown, and they had inmates with AIDS, dying of AIDS, at the prison there, and they had nobody to minister to them. And that's how I originally got into prison ministry. It wasn't without a lot of objection from me to God, because I was sure He shouldn't ask me to do that, but that's a whole different talk. In any event, after a couple of years, I asked Marcus Hepburn to join me, and then Mike Savage came with him from Blessed Sacrament, and we had a core group coming from here. But one of the highlights of those Saturdays at Appalachia Correctional was that while Deacon Marcus and Mike Savage were running Bible studies and discipleship classes for the inmates in the chapel, I was praying with men one-on-one, and all of this had to be coordinated and scheduled, and the inmates had to request an appointment. And so a chapel clerk was assigned to take care of all this for me so that it stayed under control. And his name was Kenny Cofield. Now, if any of you have read the book, Now I Walk on Death Row, you know that there's a Kenny in there, and his story is shared a bit because this is a man who at 19 years old was involved in a crime where someone was killed. It was a robbery, and it was unintentional, but the gun went off and someone was killed. And he stood trial facing the electric chair. He was given life by a jury vote of 7-5 for life. Florida, as of right now, is still the only state in the country where the jury can pick death 7-5, but in his case, they picked life 7-5. And this is the young man that I met about 6-7 years after he had come to prison at ACI. And with all the inmates that I was praying with and meeting, I realized there was something happening with this man. God was doing something incredible. And as we became partners, we stayed prayer partners for 6 years. When our family went to Rome, we continued to correspond. When we came back to the east side of the state where that other school is, over by Gainesville, because death row is right between Gainesville and Jacksonville, I got permission to be his spiritual advisor and to make the trips to Bonifay by Crestview, where at that time he was assigned. And then the department invited us as a family to become a Christian mentoring family to him. And we said, absolutely. At this point, we'd known him 12 years. We became a Christian mentoring family, and Susan and I, and Chris and Addie, began to visit him every month over in Bonifay, and then to Sumter. And then when he was moved to the pre-release program at Everglades, down south of Miami, where he was for 2 years. Susan and I were there November 17, 2009, at Everglades, at the gate, when he walked out on parole after 28 years. And we drove him to Jacksonville, where he went into a prison reentry program at Prisoners of Christ. This young man, he's not so young anymore, but I think of him as a young man, has tremendously taken advantage of this opportunity and a second chance. He works at Christian Healing Ministries with the McNutts. He is responsible for all the security. He is responsible to make sure all the 18 ladies that are working there, who are all his boss, have everything that they need and that they're safe, because the neighborhood is not as good as it used to be. And he and his wife, Kathy, who are helping to raise 2 grandchildren, speak all over the state, not just at prisons, but also at churches and at gatherings and at civic clubs, to help people understand what the options are to the state killing people and how it can work out. So I asked him to be here so that you all could meet him, and during the breaks you can get to talk to him, because this is a man who was 1 jury vote away from Old Sparky. And the last time we went to appear in front of the Parole Commission in Atlantic Beach with him, one of the commissioners said, "We want to thank you, the Parole Commission. We want to thank you, Mr. Cofield, because your choices dignify and give credibility to our entire process." So Kenny, if you would just stand up so everybody knows who you are. So thank you, Father Foley, for allowing us to be here today. And thank you, Suzanne. Where'd Suzanne go? Thank you, and the Mercy and Justice Corps community, for having this wonderful event. It is an honor to be part of it. I got to tell you, I was at the play last night, and I felt kind of pummeled. But what I was pummeled by was the reality that was being communicated about this whole situation we have with horribly violent crimes, where the life of someone's loved one or loved ones is taken. And we're in a kind of stuck in a rut here in Florida and in the Bible Belt of the Deep South, where the best we've been able to figure out to come up with is, well, that's horrible, we'll kill somebody for them. Sister Helen says it's morally bankrupt Really? That's the best we can do for you? We'll let you in about 20 or 30 years come and watch somebody else be killed. And then you'll feel better. You'll be healed. You'll have closure. I've been there. It's not true. Somebody gets killed, but nothing else happens. So what we want to do in this very brief time is bring you into a little bit of the pictures from where Susan and I have been the last 17 years at death row and in the death house, and share a little bit with you of the realities of how the death penalty really affects the people that are up close to it. The title of this talk comes from one of the things I've just said so many times, a million times. The death penalty leaves no survivors. No survivors. It doesn't just affect the man being killed, it affects everybody else involved. We have a lot of Catholic volunteers now that come to death row. There's several from Tallahassee. Mike Savage, Steve Hammond, Pete Cowdery. Where's Pete? Pete Cowdery. They come every month to death row to cell front in solitary confinement in death row as part of the Catholic team to maintain the presence of the Catholic Church inside these two massive maximum security prisons, Florida State Prison and Union Correctional. All of death row and all of long-term solitary confinement for the state of Florida is housed in these two facilities. So we have 2,000 plus men in long-term solitary confinement behind a solid steel door with a little plexiglass window and a food flap that's locked. The ministry is done through the flap. The officers have to unlock it. And death row, we have 400 people on death row in Florida. Second largest death row in the country. People don't realize that. It's one or two. We have 400 people on death row. The Guardian published an article about 2 weeks ago and said that if we kept up the new pace that Governor Scott and Attorney General Pam Bondi want to keep, which is a minimum of 1 to 1.5 executions per month, it would take 150 years to execute the people that are on death row now, even if we don't send anybody else there. In the private sector, this would have been dumped ages ago. It produces nothing, it's ineffective, and it causes harm. And it's like burning money. This is why conservatives against the death penalty are rising up all over the country and saying, you got to be kidding. In Nebraska, a red state, their legislature repealed the death penalty. Because basically they looked at it and they said, we would be doing a better job for the taxpayers if we took their tax dollars and put them in dump trucks and dumped them on the lawn in front of the Capitol and burned them. Just burn the money. That actually would be better for the taxpayers than what we're doing. But the governor of Nebraska has ambitions to go to a federal office in Washington, D.C., wants to run for national office, and he's wealthy, and so he has put up $500,000 of his own money to fund a referendum to overrule the legislature and keep the death penalty in Nebraska, because he's afraid that if he's identified as the governor who lost the death penalty in a red state, he'll have no future for elected office on a national level. Really? Let's kill people so I can get elected to the Senate. When Susan and I came back from Rome, we were kind of open in 1998 to whatever the church needed us to do. They needed a layman to make a long-term commitment to handle the cell front ministry at these two massive prisons. Father Joe, a little priest from India, incredible guy, Father Joe Maniangat, had been handling it by himself for 15 years, and his health had broken down. It's extremely debilitating, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and when you witness a botched execution, it really, really makes it difficult to keep going. And he had a botched electrocution. We'll get to that in a minute. So we prayed, and with Chris and Eddie, we discerned we would make that commitment. And we ended up in McClenny, Florida, which is full of really good people. But none of our neighbors had ever met a Catholic before. And they had all heard, growing up from the time they were knee-high, that if you're a Christian, you support the death penalty because it's in the Bible. And don't you know, that's exactly, as far as I can find, why we still have the death penalty in the United States. Over 85% of all the executions in the United States in the last 40 years, since we restarted the death penalty, have been in the old Confederacy and the slaveholding border states. It is a Bible Belt phenomenon, and we found out that everybody that supported it believed they had to, because to go against the death penalty is to go against God's will. And a lot of you are familiar with some of the work we've done, both speaking and writing, to try and overcome that and show it just ain't so. What did we find? We found these 400 cells with men in them waiting to be killed. Cages, really, 6 feet wide, 10 feet deep. No air conditioning, concrete and steel, looking at a blank wall. Deprivation of contact with human beings is part of the punishment when you're on death row. There's 5 women on Florida's death row. They're down in Ocala at a special unit. When their warrant gets signed, they are brought to Florida State Prison. That's where the death house is, which is where we kill people. And I do say we, because it doesn't say the Speaker of the House who wants to succeed his daddy as President of the Senate is killing you. It doesn't even say the governor is killing you. It says the people of the state of Florida are killing you. We kill people at Florida State Prison. And we order other people to do it because we pay them a little bit of money and give them some benefits, and so they better do it. And we never think about what it does to them either. When I first started going cell to cell, it was an eye-opener. We go to everybody. The bishops told us, you go to everybody. Not just the Catholics, not just the Christians, everybody. Didn't take long, going 4 or 5 days a week and spending the whole day going from one cell to the next to get to know every single man on Florida's death row. But I never dreamed I would get asked to be a spiritual advisor for an execution. I figured that was over my level. And then only about 18 months, 2 years into this, I got a call from the warden at home. They all call me Brother Dale. They don't even know in Rayford and Stark what a Catholic religious brother is. Brother means we accept you're Christian. You're baptized and we accept it's valid, and you seem like a Christian. So they call me Brother Dale. Even the Secretary of Corrections, when he or she calls me at home, calls me Brother Dale. So the warden calls me, Brother Dale, so-and-so's warrant was signed this morning. He's been moved to the death house, and he's asked for you to be a spiritual advisor. Will you do it? Well, of course I'll do it. Can I meet with you? He said yes. I got in the car, drove straight to FSP, to the warden's office. I said, of course I'll do it. What am I agreeing to do? He said, well, the man is usually in the death house for 5 or 6 weeks before he's executed. No one ever says killed. Everybody says executed. Like it's not killing them. By the way, if you look at the death certificate of someone executed by the state of Florida, the cause of death is homicide. Of course it is. It's a legal term that means a human being has been killed by another human being intentionally. Homicide. It's a legal homicide. But we don't say killed, we say executed, as if it's different. He said, and so your job is to be there with him those 5 or 6 weeks and help him get ready spiritually. So the man is moved to the bottom floor of Q Wing. Used to be X Wing, now it's Q Wing. And he's literally in a death row cell, just like the one he was in, except he's 10 feet from the execution chamber. And all the guys I've been with in the death house over the last 17 years have had the same experience. When they first get there, it feels like they're just in another death row cell. But as the days go by, it's almost as if that door at the end of the hall is moving toward them. And they'll tell me, I don't tell them this, but they'll tell me, man after man after man, it feels like this hall is getting shorter. So once they move to the death house, the state has stamped an expiration date on them. And I said, okay, and what about the date of execution? Oh, well, you're his witness. See, there's witnesses to the execution. Virtually everybody in the witness room is either there for the state or is a member of the family of the murder victim of that crime. Usually the state attorney who got this death sentence is there. This means he won. And he said, you will be there for him. So there's 2 seats in that entire witness room that aren't for the official witnesses and the press and the family of the murder victim. One is for the appellate lawyer of the man being killed, and the other is for the spiritual advisor. So the spiritual advisor seat is second from the left, front row, right in front of the glass, and the man is on the gurney when the curtain opens, and he is able to turn his head and look straight at us. And the reason they let me be there, or let any other spiritual advisor be there, is so that this man who is despised and hated and discarded, and everybody out there wants him killed, has one person, at least, that he can look at while he dies, who's there because they love him. I said, okay. And then the word said, also, usually their family starts coming in to say goodbye that last week. And so you will be helping the family during that week. I said, are they going to be in the witness room at the execution? No, Florida does not allow the family of the condemned to be in the witness room. If you want to do that, you have to spend the money to build a second witness room. You can't put the family of the condemned and the family of the murder victim all together sitting next to each other watching this. So Florida tells the family of the condemned, after they say goodbye the morning of the execution, they need to leave the prison premises and they're not to come back. And there's a SWAT team at the gate to make sure they don't try and come back. Because if there's ever a risk that somebody's going to do something crazy to spring their loved one, it's the day the state is going to be killing their loved one at 6 o'clock. I said, well, where do they go? He said, well, we don't know. It's not our job. He said, most of them go to Stark and sit in a motel, and they'll watch the TV to see whether or not it happened at 6 o'clock. I said, who's taking care of them? He said, Chap, that's not our job. Our job is to make sure they leave before 12 noon and that they don't come back. Well, when I shared this with Susan, Susan said, this is unconscionable. And she contacted the bishops through our priest and said if the church will accept it, she would make it her service to take care of the family of the condemned when they come to town and to be with them during the execution. And the bishops said, please, please do that. Now, we had both ministered to families of murder victims, and we still make ourselves available to do that in non-death penalty cases. We can't be on both sides of a criminal case. We're both licensed professionals. That's not allowed. So we make ourselves available to be with families of murder victims when they're struggling to deal with the news, usually that they just got, that their son, their daughter, their grandson, their wife, their mother has been killed. And that's a horrible experience. To sit with a mother in her living room, Susan on one side, me on the other, literally less than hours after she got the call that her son, who she said goodbye to this morning when he went to work, was shot in the back of the head in the parking lot walking away from a fight that he didn't want to have, and he's dead. It's horrible. But who would guess? Who would guess in the 21st century that our enlightened answer to this is, oh, well, we're going to make sure another family gets that phone call. And guess who gets to call them usually? The spiritual advisor. By the way, Brother Dale, here's the list of his family and all their phone numbers. And you need to call them and tell them what day it's happening and when they can come to visit and what the rules are. So our answer to the horrible phone call that the family of the victim got is to make sure we have horrible phone calls with the family of the person that did the crime. Let's create another family of victims. That'll even it out. Really? That's the best we can do? I know some people think it's great for poll numbers, especially if you want to run for U.S. Senate after you're governor. But does this really do any good for anybody? We want to share with you some of the specific snapshots of how this affects people. Like, for example, the mentally ill. It is not true that the mentally ill are not subject to execution. You don't even have to know who you are or what your name is to be legally competent to be executed in the United States. You need to know what it means to be dead and that you're going to be dead because you did something bad. If you can handle those two concepts, you are legally competent to be executed. In one stretch of 12 executions, 7, right here in Florida, 7 of the 12 had been medically diagnosed as severely mentally ill. It's no accident that the states with the worst performance on mental health services also have the highest rates of execution. At this point, Florida and Georgia and Alabama and Texas can all take a bow. I've been spiritual advisor to some psychotically mentally ill men and could not fathom that civilized people could think this was civilized. But we do it. We do it. Over 10% of the people on America's death rows are severely mentally ill. And when you bring that up and start talking about it, you're accused of coddling criminals and being against the victims of the crime. What about veterans? Nobody wants to talk about veterans. Rah, 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 siskumbah. What about veterans? We ship them off to Korea, to Vietnam, to Iraq, to Fallujah, to Afghanistan. It's finally being talked about. Veterans Day 2015, the Death Penalty Information Center released a report. More than 10% of the men on America's death rows, men and women, more than 10% are veterans, mostly with PTSD and mental illness from their service. Nobody's ever talked about that before. I am pastoral advisor to men that are veterans on Florida's death row, and I can tell you in some cases, the state used their medals for courage in live fire in combat to prove how dangerous they are to get them a death sentence. Really? Is anybody talking about this? Thank you for your service, and if you lose it and commit a crime and somebody dies, we're going to mention that you're dangerous because you served your country in Fallujah and get a death sentence for you, because that'll help me get promoted to be a senior prosecutor or a judge or run for House or Senate or maybe even governor on the backs of veterans Finally, in November, 3 retired generals came out with a public statement in USA Today calling for a congressional investigation into why our prosecutors are putting veterans on death row. Why indeed? I have a suspicion. I think it has something to do with the fact that you don't get much face time on TV if you get somebody sentenced to life in prison, but if you get a death sentence, you can launch a new political career. Who cares if they're a veteran? I mean, what is this really about? And what about the other human beings that are close to this? Nobody thinks about the staff. What does it do to good people who are simply working their job as corrections officers to be on the death squad? A picture. I'm in the death house with a man. He happened to be a vet. I also believe this particular man was innocent. That's not really relevant once you get past the trial stage. Once you're in your appeals, innocence is almost irrelevant. It's all procedurally barred. Courts have said they can't hear it. We're in the death house. It's 3 o'clock. I'm going to have to leave him in about 30 minutes because the strap-down team is going to come to get him into his execution clothes and bring him to the place where they'll strap him down to the gurney. And this big burly sergeant comes in. Everybody at FSP knew this guy. Big burly redneck. This guy put the red in redneck. That's what everybody used to say about him. And he says, "Chap, give me the front." Meaning, step aside and let me be in front of the cell. I said, "Absolutely, Sergeant." I stepped back. And this big, burly country sergeant steps up to the cell and he says to the guy inside, "I wanted you to know, I refused to work second shift. I refused to be here when it happens. They wanted me to work, but I refused." And the man inside said, "Thank you, Sergeant." And then the sergeant said, "I'm not done." He said, "I've been knowing you 20 years at this prison. I don't know what you were like when you were out there on the street and you were all coked up and on drugs and all that. I didn't know that person. But I know the person that's been here for 20 years. And I know that you are a better human being than I am." And with tears pulling at his eyes, the sergeant said, "I know you're going to go straight from that gurney to the lap of Jesus. And I pray that someday I'll get to heaven and I'll see you again." And he took the man's hands and he said, "Goodbye, good man." That was on a Thursday. The execution went as scheduled at 6 o'clock. Monday morning, that sergeant called in and resigned. He walked away from his benefits. He walked away from his seniority and his job. He walked away from his retirement. For years, nobody talked about what this does to the people that work in these prisons. But now the wardens that retire are finally breaking silence. Ron McAndrew, the warden at FSP, the warden from Texas, the warden from Mississippi who supervised gas chamber executions, the warden from Angola. They're finally breaking the silence and saying, the people who have to participate in this state killing ritual as part of their job, it destroys them and it destroys their families. Because we're not made, God didn't make us to kill a healthy person at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock and go home and feel good about it. And so those bruises that are on the soul frequently over time start to show up on the bodies of the people that share space with the person who's dying inside because their job includes killing people. We're destroying people on the staff. Well, then I have folks say, well, wait a minute. This is for the family of the murder victim. Really? Let's go through a couple more pictures, and I want you to have in your head the question, who's the killing for? Usually sitting right next to me in the front row in the witness room is either the family of the murder victim or the victim advocate from the governor's office who's sitting between me and the family of the murder victim. As I said, Susan and I together have experienced the agony of the families of murder victims. There are no sides in this. This isn't a football game, who wins. This is horror being magnified and multiplied by the state. And so I have nothing but compassion for the person sitting next to me who is the family of the murder victim. This particular crime, the man who's going to be on the gurney when the curtain opens, rape murdered the woman who was this young woman's favorite aunt. It's an interracial murder. Hot in the press. When the man asked for me to be a spiritual advisor and I agreed, I heard from more than a few people about taking sides against my own kind. Really? What century are we in? This poor young woman, who at this point is in her 30s, is wound up like a spring on a clock. And I find myself praying silently, not just for him, but also for her. They open the curtain, they read the warrant, they start the poison into his veins, they pronounce him dead, and the curtain closes. And this poor young woman erupts out of her seat with her fists in the air. Is that it? Is that all there is? I'm looking at the victim's advocate on the other side of her. I know what she was thinking, what I was thinking, which is, if she starts beating on the glass, we've got to stop her. She's going to hurt herself. But thank the Lord, she got herself under control, and she just left, shaking her head. Bud Welch, whose daughter was killed in the Oklahoma City bombing, speaks around the country with murder victims' families for reconciliation, the message that only forgiveness brings healing. And I said, Bud, you've been there. Tell me, what was happening? He said, she realized in that moment when they pronounced him dead that the state had lied to her for 20 years. For 20 years. Stick with us. Keep demanding the death penalty. And when you watch this man be executed, you will feel better. You will feel closure. You will feel healed. And he said to me in that moment, she knew she'd been had. Nothing had changed. And he speaks about how after the Oklahoma City bombing and the execution of Timothy Veigh, where the feds put in bleachers so they could try and get as many victims' family members in to watch as possible, quietly, people have come to him one by one and said, I wish I hadn't gone. I wish I hadn't bought the lie. They told me it would make me feel better. It would make me feel healed. And it didn't do anything for me. And now I've got 2 killings in my head to deal with. No, I'm sorry. It's not for her. Family of the condemned. 72 hours after that moment, I was with the appellate lawyer driving to southwest Georgia in the middle of nowhere to the widow of the man we had just executed. She literally had to be one of the poorest people I've ever met in the United States. I've met poorer overseas, but not in the United States. She lived in a shack next to the railroad tracks with holes in the outside walls. And we were bringing her husband's cremains to her. I hate to say it, but if you do this long enough, you learn where to stand. So when she let us come in, she knew who we were and why we were there. The attorney had the box with the cremains, and I just quietly stepped around over next to her to catch her when she collapsed. And the lawyer opened the lid and showed her that inside were the ashes of her husband. And she collapsed. And I held her in my arms until she was able to gather enough composure to speak. And she said, "Why did they have to kill him?" She said, "Next to my mother, he was the only person in my entire life that treated me well. Why did they have to kill him? Why couldn't they just let him live in prison?" And I had no answer. How do we answer? When we know the state would save $51 million a year with life in prison without parole instead of executions. How do we answer, why did they have to kill him? It wasn't for her. It's not for us. We're getting fleeced. All that money goes to lawyers. It's like a welfare to work program for state lawyers on the state side. Hundreds of lawyers on the state side whose entire careers, their whole life, live off the pipeline of death row cases. Their vacations, their condos at the beach, their medical benefits, their retirement, their kids' college is all supported by this pipeline of death row cases as they sit in state offices and process this through and object to anything that shows that the person shouldn't be executed by screaming procedural bar. It's too late, the courts can't look at it. Justice Scalia, and now I have to say, God rest his soul, was a great jurist. He and Clarence Thomas have been the two most pro-death penalty justices on the U.S. Supreme Court over the last 20 years. And in a written opinion, they said, if you have the death penalty, you will kill innocent people. Because our criminal justice system is a human system, and human systems make mistakes. Scalia went on to say, and this is in writing, in Kansas v. Marsh, 2006, the only way to ensure you don't execute innocent people is to get rid of the death penalty. But that is not for the courts to do. That is up to the state legislatures. This is why we're here today. This is why we're here today. We're never going to stop the folks sitting up there on the hill from doing this before they vote. We have to change the direction of the wind. So that when they do this, they say, oh, killing people in premeditated homicides in a building in the middle of nowhere in Stark isn't going to be good for my political career anymore, so I'm going to vote against it. That's how we're going to stop it. Our bishops have asked us to. Our Pope has asked us to. Our church has been asking us to since 1980. Every other major faith group, the leadership has come out against the continuation of the use of the death penalty. For a long time, the evangelicals were kind of not doing that. And then just this past October, they reversed a 40-year position. The National Association of Evangelical Churches reversed a 40-year position and said, you can be for repeal of the death penalty without going against Scripture. The Southern Baptist Convention hasn't gotten there yet, but they have said, if you're going to have it, you've got to make it fair and just and equitable. Oh, really? Who are we kidding? Race and wealth are the two main statistical drivers of whether or not someone gets a death penalty. If you make that fair and equitable, it won't be politically popular anymore. There won't be any point in having it. So I treat that statement as the equivalent as a call for repeal. We need to put this in our past. The death penalty has no place in our present. It's a shame in our history, and we don't want it in our children's futures. And so we are gathered here this morning to ask you to open your hearts to hear the other folks who will be speaking today that are going to be talking about what we have to do to change the direction of the wind. And we hope you will feel invigorated to become part, a big part, of making that happen. Thank you for being here this morning.